In 1844, in the heart of Charleston, something happened at a slave auction that witnesses would later describe as impossible. Men with wealth, power, and influence all wanted one woman, and not just for the reason history expects. She was desired beyond reason, priced beyond logic, and surrounded by a secret so dangerous it was quietly erased from the record books. Tonight, we uncover the impossible truth behind the most desired female slave ever sold in Charleston, and why her story was never meant to be told. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel if you're ready for the untold stories history tried to bury. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's begin. In the autumn of 1844, something happened in Charleston, South Carolina, that would confound historians, perplex economic scholars, and raise questions about power, desire, and the very nature of human exploitation that remain unanswered to this day. A woman, a single enslaved woman, became the object of an auction that defied every convention of the time. The bidding reached heights that seemed impossible. Wealthy planters and merchants who had never been known to spend lavishly on human property suddenly found themselves in a frenzy of competitive acquisition. Men who prided themselves on rational calculation and business acumen became consumed with winning her. And when it was over, when the gavel fell and the transaction was complete, the buyer immediately sealed away all records, all documentation, all traces of what had occurred. For nearly 2 centuries, the historical record has been remarkably silent. But the silence itself is deafening, because silence in the hands of those with power is a choice, and choices always leave fingerprints. Her name was Catherine. That much we know, but almost everything else exists in the margins of official accounts, in letters written in hushed tones and later destroyed, in the careful omissions of estate inventories, in the architectural decisions of the grand houses where she may have lived. The question that haunts us, that should haunt us, is not simply who she was, but why the men of Charleston went to such lengths to ensure that her story, her truth, her very existence as anything more than a commodity, would be erased from the historical record. This is a story about obsession. It is a story about the lengths that individuals will go to in order to possess something they believe they cannot live without. It is a story about secrecy, about the compartmentalization of desire, about how nations and individuals alike construct elaborate systems to hide the truths that contradict their carefully maintained self-images. And it is a story that demands we ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves, about what drives human behavior when we believe no one is watching, when consequences seem distant, when power appears absolute. In 1844, Charleston was a city of contradictions. On the surface, it was cultured, refined, the jewel of the South. Its churches boasted soaring steeples, its homes were architectural masterpieces. Its citizens engaged in philosophy, literature, and the arts. Yet beneath this veneer ran a current of something darker, a systematic dehumanization that had become so normalized, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that many had stopped seeing it as anything remarkable. This was simply how the world worked. This was order. This was civilization. But every system of that magnitude, every machinery of exploitation operating at such a scale, contains within it the seeds of its own contradiction. And sometimes those contradictions manifest in ways that the architects of that system never anticipated. Sometimes they manifest in the form of a single human being who, through circumstances we can only partially reconstruct, became impossibly valuable, not as a worker, not as breeding stock, not through any traditional metric that would have been used to assess enslaved people at that time, but through something else, something that the men involved seemed desperate to conceal. The documentation that survives is fragmented. It consists of purchase receipts that are deliberately vague, of shipping manifests with suspicious gaps, of letters between prominent citizens that refer to the matter or the arrangement without ever naming specifics. One historian, Margaret Colson, spent 15 years researching the slave trade in Charleston, and she discovered references to this auction in exactly 3 sources, all of them secondary, all of them offering different accounts of what actually occurred. When she attempted to trace these accounts back to their original sources, she found that the original documents no longer existed. They had been lost to fire, she was told, to flood, to the simple passage of time and the carelessness of archivists. But here is what we do know. On October 14, 1844, an auction took place at the premises of Tarleton and Sons, the most prestigious slave trading house in Charleston. The auction was not widely advertised, which was unusual. Word of mouth spread the information among a select group of potential buyers, men of exceptional wealth and social standing. The lot contained 47 individuals, ranging in age from infancy to 60 years old. It was an ordinary arrangement in almost every respect, except for one entry in the auction catalog, an entry that breaks from the standard format used for all the other lots. While other individuals were described with brutal efficiency: strong male, age 28, good field hand, sound wind, or young woman, age 19, robust health, experience in household management. Catherine's entry read simply, Lot 31, Catherine, age 22, special qualifications, reserve price. There was no mention of her skills, no mention of her health or physical condition, no mention of her background or her abilities. Just those 2 words repeated in no other lot in the entire catalog. Special qualifications. The reserve price listed was substantial, a figure that set it apart immediately as unusual. But what happened next was entirely unprecedented. The bidding did not proceed in the normal fashion. Instead, when Lot 31 was called, something occurred that observers struggled to put into words. Some accounts describe it as an unusual intensity. Others refer to a charged atmosphere. What we can establish is that the bidding climbed and continued to climb, far beyond what any enslaved person, regardless of their skills or abilities, had ever commanded in the Charleston market. A plantation owner named Silas Blackwood submitted the first bid. He was a wealthy man, owner of nearly 3,000 acres and close to 200 enslaved people. His initial bid was reasonable, nothing that suggested the beginning of anything extraordinary. But then another man entered the bidding. This was Thomas Wardwell, a merchant with interests in maritime trade and real estate. Wardwell was known as a cautious businessman, a man who made decisions based on careful calculation of profit margins. The bid escalated. Blackwood countered. Wardwell raised again. And then something unexpected happened. Other men who had shown no particular interest in the auction up until that point, began placing bids. Some of them were not even listed in the original documentation of who attended that day. The bidding continued for what witnesses later recalled as an unusually long period of time. In most auctions, even valuable lots were dispensed with in minutes. This sale of a single individual continued for what some accounts suggest were nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in the context of 19th century auctions. In the end, Wardwell prevailed. The final price was $6,000. To put this in perspective, the average price for an enslaved man in 1844 was approximately $800. Even the most expensive lots, skilled craftspeople, young men with agricultural expertise or mechanical knowledge, rarely exceeded $2,000. $6,000 was what someone might pay for an entire plantation house. It was what a prosperous businessman might spend on expanding his entire operation. For a single woman whose abilities were never specified, whose skills were never detailed, it was staggering. It was impossible. It made no economic sense according to the logic that supposedly governed these transactions. Immediately after the sale, the nature of Wardwell's business changed. He liquidated significant portions of his holdings and retired from public life. Within 6 months, he had relocated to the interior of South Carolina, to a region far removed from Charleston's social circles. The house he built, we have records of its construction, was isolated, set back from the nearest road by nearly a mile of private land. It was built with unusually high walls and limited windows. The workers hired to construct it reported working under strict supervision, with explicit instructions not to discuss the project with anyone outside the immediate work crew. In the decades that followed, information about what happened to Catherine, what Wardwell did with her, how she lived, whether she had contact with the outside world, became increasingly obscured. There are hints, fragments, inconsistencies that suggest some kind of elaborate secret was being maintained. An entry in a county record book from 1861 lists C as one of the residents of Wardwell's estate, but provides no other identifying information. A letter from Wardwell's sister, discovered among private papers in the 1970s, contains a cryptic reference to the matter which we do not discuss. When Wardwell died in 1879, his will made specific, unusual provisions. Certain rooms in his house were to remain sealed, their contents undisturbed, until 30 years after his death. The directive came with a substantial financial penalty if these instructions were not followed. When 1909 arrived and the prescribed time had passed, the rooms were finally opened. But by then, something had happened. Whether through deterioration, whether through deliberate action, the rooms were found to be empty of anything of significance. Personal effects were missing. Any documentation that might have been stored there was gone. Even furniture and fixtures had been removed. So what was the secret? What was Catherine that made her worth $6,000? What was she that required such elaborate concealment? And why did these men of standing, men of influence, men whose social position depended on the maintenance of particular public images, why did they go to such lengths to hide what they had done? Some historians have theorized that Catherine possessed rare skills, that she was perhaps highly educated, literate, capable of performing intellectual labor that would have been shocking if publicly acknowledged. Others have suggested that her value lay in her appearance, that she embodied something that men desired so intensely that they competed for her regardless of economic rationality. Still, others have pointed to the possibility that she possessed information, knowledge, that made her valuable to those in power. Secrets that men would pay extraordinary sums to keep contained. But there are deeper questions here. Questions about power and desire. Questions about the ways in which systems of oppression create their own perversions. Questions about how individuals within those systems experience contradiction, how they rationalize their participation, how they maintain the fiction that what they are doing is natural, is normal, is justified. And perhaps most disturbingly, questions about whether we ourselves, separated by nearly 2 centuries, presumably enlightened, presumably moral, are capable of recognizing the systems of exploitation that we participate in without question, the silences we maintain, the stories we allow to be erased. To understand what happened to Catherine, we must first understand Charleston in 1844. We must understand it not as it presented itself to the world, but as it actually functioned. We must understand the economic machinery that drove it, the philosophical justifications that sustained it, and most importantly, the hidden desires that animated it. Charleston in the mid-19th century was one of the wealthiest cities in North America. For most of the 18th century, it had been the wealthiest. Its prosperity was built entirely on slavery. The rice plantations of the surrounding low country generated extraordinary wealth. The slave trade itself was a major source of commerce and profit. And the city had constructed around itself an elaborate cultural and intellectual apparatus designed to justify this arrangement, to make it seem not only natural but inevitable, not only profitable but morally correct. The men who controlled Charleston were not stupid. They were, by the standards of their time, educated, cultured, well-read. Many of them had traveled to Europe. They engaged with contemporary philosophical movements. They commissioned art, built libraries, patronized music and literature. They saw themselves as the standard-bearers of civilization in a rough and undeveloped continent. They saw themselves as men of refinement and principle. And yet these same men participated in, indeed they built their fortunes on, a system that regarded human beings as property, that treated the bodies of enslaved people as commodities to be bought, sold, worked to death, and replaced. The contradiction between their self-image as enlightened men and their actual participation in this machinery of suffering was so profound that maintaining it required extraordinary psychological effort. It required the construction of elaborate justifications. It required the constant reinforcement of narratives that positioned enslaved people as naturally suited to slavery, as somehow fundamentally different from their white counterparts, as incapable of the feelings and intellectual capacities that would have made slavery morally indefensible. These justifications were not cynical, at least not entirely. Many of them were believed, genuinely believed, by those who articulated them, and this belief paradoxically allowed these men to continue their participation in the system. They could convince themselves that they were not monsters. They were not cruelty for its own sake. They were simply men maintaining a system that, in their view, was natural, was ordered, was how the world worked. But what happened when that system produced something that challenged these justifications? What happened when an enslaved person possessed qualities that made them impossible to reduce to the simple narratives of inferiority and natural subjugation? What happened when desire, that most fundamental and uncontrollable of human impulses, overrode the rational calculations that supposedly governed the slave trade? This is the context in which we must understand Catherine. She appeared in the historical record at a moment when Charleston's system was coming under increasing pressure. The abolitionist movement in the North was growing stronger. There was increasing vocal opposition to slavery in the wider world. Within the slave-holding South, there was increasing anxiety about maintaining the system, increasing rigidity in the enforcement of racial hierarchies. increasing paranoia about rebellion and resistance. This was not a stable system at peace with itself. This was a system increasingly aware of its own vulnerability, increasingly desperate to maintain control. And into this atmosphere of tension and anxiety came Catherine. We do not know her origins. The auction records do not specify where she came from, how long she had been enslaved, what her experience had been before she arrived in Charleston. But we can infer certain things from the way she was treated. She was not a field hand. The special qualifications notation suggests skills, knowledge, or abilities that set her apart. She must have possessed something that the other 46 individuals in that auction lot did not possess. Some researchers have attempted to reconstruct Catherine's background through other means. If we look at patterns of movement through the slave trade, if we examine where Charleston traders sourced their merchandise, we can determine that she likely came from a city, either Savannah, Baltimore, or possibly even from further afield. Urban slavery was different from plantation slavery. Enslaved people in cities sometimes acquired literacy, sometimes possessed specialized skills, sometimes moved through a broader range of human interaction than their counterparts in rural areas. If Catherine had been urban slavery, she would have had exposure to a wider world, more opportunity to develop as an individual, more awareness of possibilities beyond her immediate circumstances. There is evidence to suggest that she may have been literate. One of the few archival sources that mentions Catherine by name, a letter from a Charleston woman named Eleanor Prescott to her sister in Boston, dated November 1844, contains a cryptic reference. I have heard rumors concerning the recent acquisition of a very unusual specimen, one possessed of unusual faculties and capable of discourse on matters that would surprise us both. T.W. appears to be quite taken with his purchase and has made arrangements of a most particular nature. I confess I am both fascinated and revolted in equal measure by what I have heard. The mention of discourse or conversation is suggestive. It implies that Catherine was not only capable of speech, but of sophisticated speech, of engagement in intellectual exchange. This would have been extraordinary. This would have been transgressive. This would have been the kind of thing that men would keep secret, that they would go to great lengths to conceal. Why would literacy be so dangerous? Why would the ability to engage in conversation be something worth $6,000 in elaborate concealment? To understand this, we must understand what literacy meant in the context of slavery. Literacy was not merely the ability to read and write. Literacy was an assertion of humanity, of capacity for thought and independent judgment. It was a potential gateway to dangerous ideas. In many southern states, teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal. It was understood quite correctly as a threat to the system. An enslaved person who could read could access information beyond what they were told. They could understand the arguments for abolition. They could conceive of alternative realities. They could, in short, challenge the narratives that justified their enslavement. And yet some enslaved people were literate. Some had taught themselves. Some had learned before enslavement. Some had been educated by previous owners who either did not understand the danger or did not care about the law. These individuals represented a particular threat, but they also represented something else. A living contradiction to the narratives that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual development, that they were naturally suited to servitude, that the hierarchy of the racial system was natural and inevitable. If Catherine was literate, if she was intelligent, if she was capable of sophisticated thought and articulate expression, then she represented a fundamental challenge to the ideological foundations of slavery itself. And for a man like Thomas Wardwell, acquiring her and keeping her secret might not have been motivated primarily by economic logic. It might have been motivated by something else entirely. It might have been motivated by the desire to possess the contradiction itself, to own the evidence that contradicted the system he participated in, to keep that evidence hidden away where it could not undermine the careful justifications he had constructed. But there are other theories as well. Some historians have suggested that Catherine may have been involved in the Underground Railroad, that she had connections to abolitionist networks, that she possessed knowledge of escape routes, of safe houses, of networks that endangered the system. If this were the case, then her high price might have reflected a deliberate effort by powerful men to remove her from circulation, to prevent her from continuing work that threatened them. Others have speculated that Catherine was the biological daughter of a prominent white man, that she was the product of what historians now call the shadow family, the children born from the sexual exploitation of enslaved women by their white owners. These children sometimes occupied ambiguous positions within the slavery system, sometimes received preferential treatment, sometimes were objects of complicated feelings of guilt and responsibility from their white fathers. If Catherine was the child of a powerful man, her acquisition by another powerful man might have been less about her abilities and more about preventing awkward revelations, about containing a shameful secret, about maintaining the public fiction that slavery could be morally justified. The problem is that we cannot know. The historical record had been too thoroughly obscured. Those who knew the truth took deliberate steps to ensure that it would not be preserved. But the very fact that they took these steps, the very fact that they were willing to spend extraordinary sums and risk social awkwardness to maintain secrecy, tells us something. It tells us that the secret was valuable. It tells us that it was dangerous. It tells us that it threatened something important, either to Wardwell individually or to the system he represented, or both. Let us now examine the behavior of Thomas Wardwell more closely. Who was he? What do we know about his life, his circumstances, his character? And what does his behavior in the matter of Catherine reveal about the nature of desire and possession in this historical moment? Thomas Wardwell was born in 1789, which made him 55 years old at the time of the auction. He was the son of a merchant, himself successful, but Thomas had exceeded his father's achievements. He was involved in maritime trade, importing goods from the Caribbean and Europe, exporting rice and other products from the Carolina Lowcountry. He had investments in multiple ventures. He maintained social standing through careful participation in the right social organizations, the right churches, the right gatherings. He was married, though reports from the time suggest his marriage was cordial rather than passionate. He had no children, which was something of a source of private concern to him. He was, by all accounts, a measured man, a man of habit and routine, a man whose life was organized and controlled. And then in 1844, at the age of 55, something changed. The transition was not immediate, but it was noticeable to those around him. He began withdrawing from public appearances. His business activities became less visible. Where previously he had been a regular attendee at social events, he became increasingly selective about which invitations he accepted. His participation in the affairs of his church, his club, The various civic organizations that structured elite life in Charleston, these diminished. He was not absent entirely, but he was becoming increasingly peripheral. More dramatically, he began making significant financial decisions that suggested a major reorientation of his priorities. He began selling off portions of his maritime trading business. He liquidated real estate holdings in Charleston itself. He was converting wealth that was tied to his active participation in commerce into capital that could support a retreat from that participation. Over the course of approximately 18 months, from October 1844 to April 1846, he transformed himself from an active member of Charleston's merchant class into something approaching a hermit. The property he purchased, deep in the interior of South Carolina, was remote. It consisted of approximately 400 acres of forest and cleared land. It was positioned on a tributary of the Congaree River, which provided water and some degree of seclusion. The house he built was substantial, not ostentatiously large, but well constructed, built to last, containing multiple rooms and functional spaces. But the distinguishing feature was its defensive architecture. The windows were smaller than those in comparable houses of the period. The walls were constructed with extra thickness. The property was enclosed with a high fence, unusual for a rural estate, and the fence itself was designed to prevent view from outside to inside. Why would a man spend such resources on privacy? Why would he design his own residence as if it were a fortress or a prison, or both simultaneously? During the construction of the house, Wardwell employed a workforce that was kept deliberately compartmentalized. Different crews worked on different sections with minimal overlap. They were instructed not to discuss the work with people outside the project. They were not permitted to tour the completed sections. This was highly unusual for the period. Typically, construction projects were public affairs, places where information circulated freely, where workers gossiped about their employers and their projects. Once the house was complete, Wardwell lived there. He did not die there. He lived another 35 years until 1879. But his life was transformed into something entirely different from what it had been before. He maintained no regular household staff beyond a small number of people brought with him from Charleston. He conducted his remaining business affairs through correspondence and occasional journeys to Charleston, but these journeys became increasingly infrequent. He became a recluse, and a recluse with resources sufficient to maintain that reclusion indefinitely. What we are observing is not simply withdrawal from society, though it was that. We are observing transformation driven by obsession. The question is, obsession with what? The most conventional explanation, that he was obsessed with Catherine as a sexual object, that he had purchased her as a concubine, is possible, but it seems insufficient to explain the scale of what he did. Men of his era and his position commonly maintained sexual relationships with enslaved women. Such arrangements were generally conducted with minimal secrecy, or at least with the kind of secrecy that was commonly understood and accepted within elite circles. The children produced from such unions were acknowledged, if not publicly, at least within the private understanding of the community. These arrangements were wrong, morally horrific, but they were not exceptional. They did not drive men to isolation, to the construction of fortresses, to the dramatic reorientation of their entire lives. A second explanation holds that Catherine possessed knowledge that was dangerous to Wardwell. Perhaps she was connected to abolitionist networks. Perhaps she had been involved in resistance, in organizing, in planning. Perhaps she had information that could expose Wardwell's participation in illicit slave trade, in activities beyond what the law allowed. In this scenario, the secrecy was motivated by protection of his interests, keeping Catherine contained so that she could not share information that would damage him. But again, this seems insufficient. There were simpler ways to neutralize such threats. There were methods that would not require the permanent commitment of resources and the disruption of his entire life. A third explanation is more psychological. Perhaps Catherine embodied something that Wardwell needed to possess, to control, to keep hidden. Perhaps she represented the contradiction within the slavery system itself, the living evidence that enslaved people were human, that they were capable of thought and feeling and desire, that the entire ideological apparatus that justified slavery was built on a fundamental lie. Perhaps Wardwell, through an act of either conscious or unconscious rebellion, decided to purchase that contradiction, to own the proof that slavery could not be morally justified, and then to keep it hidden because the revelation would be unbearable, not just for him, but for the entire system he participated in. This third explanation connects to something that modern psychology has helped us understand about systems of oppression and the individuals within them. Those who benefit from oppressive systems experience what might be called a double consciousness. They must maintain two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. They must believe that they are good people, that their system is just, that their participation is morally defensible. And yet, at some level, they must know the truth. They must be aware of the suffering they cause, the humanity they deny, the basic moral law they violate. The typical response to this contradiction is what we might call compartmentalization. People separate the parts of their life that require them to acknowledge the contradiction from the parts where they can maintain the illusion. They do not reflect too deeply. They do not allow themselves to witness too fully. They maintain the fiction through a combination of ideology, distraction, and selective attention. But what happens when something forces them to truly acknowledge the contradiction? What happens when they are confronted directly and undeniably with evidence of the humanity of those they have denied humanity to? Psychological research suggests that this confrontation can produce intense emotional responses. It can produce shame, anger, fear, and often a desperate desire to regain control, to reassert the ideological framework that has been damaged. If Catherine was an individual who could not be denied, who was literate, articulate, obviously intelligent and human, then possessing her and keeping her hidden would serve a particular psychological function for Wardwell. It would allow him to acknowledge in private the truth about slavery and about his participation in it. It would allow him to take responsibility in a limited way for this one individual who had been forced into his possession. But by keeping her hidden, by ensuring that no one else could see her, he could prevent this acknowledgement from spreading, from threatening the larger systems of denial that held Charleston society together. If this theory is correct, and we must emphasize that it is speculative, based on fragmentary evidence and psychological theory rather than documented fact, then the price Wardwell paid was not primarily for Catherine's abilities or her appearance or her labor. It was for the private confession that the system was wrong, purchased at the cost of complete isolation, of the surrender of everything that had previously given his life structure and meaning. There is a letter written by Eleanor Prescott to her sister in late 1844 that is suggestive of this interpretation. Eleanor wrote, I have made inquiries regarding the nature of the acquisition, discreetly, of course, for such matters are not discussed openly. But what I have learned fills me with a confusion of feelings I can scarcely articulate. It appears that T.W. has purchased not merely a creature of labor, but someone of unusual faculties, capable of thought and expression. If this is indeed the case, one must wonder what occupies his mind, to have spent so considerable a sum on such an acquisition, and then to retreat from the world entirely. Is it guilt? Is it protection of a terrible secret? Or is it something yet more complicated, some recognition of wrongs done that cannot be undone, but only contained? I confess I do not know, and I confess that my not knowing troubles me greatly. Eleanor's letter suggests that even among Charleston's elite, there was awareness of the contradiction that Catherine represented. There was consciousness, however dimly articulated, that something profound had occurred in that auction, that something about it violated the normal operations of the system, that it revealed something that should remain hidden. What was Catherine's life like after she became Wardwell's property? What can we reconstruct about the decades she spent with him in that isolated house? The evidence here becomes even more fragmentary. We have no written records that Catherine produced herself. We have no letters, no diary entries, no direct testimony. What we have are the fragments of evidence left behind by others, the indirect testimony, the gaps and absences in the historical record. There were servants on the property, though their number seems to have been kept small and carefully controlled. Some of these servants were brought with Wardwell from Charleston, bound to him through prior relationships. Others were enslaved people purchased by Wardwell from local sources, and the records show that he purchased remarkably few people, perhaps 7 or 8 individuals over the course of his decades of residence there. This is unusual. A man of his wealth with a property of that size would typically maintain a larger workforce. The deliberate minimization of staff suggests an attempt to limit the number of people who would have access to the interior of the house, who would know what was occurring there. One of the servants, a man named Samuel Johnson, was interviewed long after the fact in the 1930s by a journalist who was researching the history of Congaree County. Samuel had worked on the property as a young man for approximately 3 years in the 1860s, and was able to provide some details about what he observed. The account is limited and mediated through the journalist's transcription, but it contains some valuable information. Samuel reported that the house was divided into 2 sections. The front portion, which faced the road and contained the major public rooms, was maintained in a manner befitting a man of Wardwell's station. It was clean, well furnished, and arranged to present an image of refined gentility to the rare visitors who came. The rear portion of the house, by contrast, was severely restricted. Samuel was instructed never to enter certain rooms without explicit permission. The meals that he prepared were often separated into 2 portions, one prepared for Wardwell himself to be served in the front rooms, and another prepared with what Samuel described as particular care for delivery to the rear. Samuel was not permitted to see the rear rooms clearly. They were kept locked, and the key was retained by Wardwell himself. Samuel reported that he occasionally glimpsed the interior when a door was opened, and he described it as sparsely furnished, with books and papers, and most remarkably, with what he believed were writing materials. When asked whether he saw a woman in the rear rooms, Samuel's response, as recorded by the journalist, was evasive. He acknowledged that he had heard someone moving about in those spaces, that he had sometimes heard voices, though never loud. When pressed on whether he had ever actually seen a woman, he refused to answer directly, saying only that such matters were not his concern, and that those who worked for Mr. Wardwell understood the importance of discretion. This is one of the few direct testimonies that suggests Catherine may have been kept in semi-imprisonment in the rear of Wardwell's house. Not locked in a cell, not chained, but confined to particular spaces separated from the outside world, prevented from normal interaction with other people. Whether this was physical constraint or psychological, whether she understood that she had no realistic option to escape, we cannot know. But the evidence suggests that her life was one of profound isolation. Why would Wardwell do this? What was the purpose of keeping her confined? One possibility is that he was attempting to prevent her from coming into contact with the wider world, with the networks of resistance that existed even in the interior of South Carolina, with any possibility of escape or contact with abolitionists. If she was literate, if she was intelligent, if she possessed knowledge or connections that were dangerous, then containing her would have been a logical precaution. But there is another possibility. Perhaps Wardwell was not merely confining Catherine, but was engaged in a project of recreation with her. Perhaps the isolation was not punitive, but rather the condition of a particular kind of relationship. In the isolation of that house, removed from the social hierarchy of Charleston, away from the public performance of race and power that characterized the visible world, perhaps they conducted a different kind of relationship. Perhaps Wardwell, in his isolation, was attempting to treat Catherine as something approaching an equal, to engage with her intellectually, to read with her, to discuss ideas, to interact with her as a human being rather than as property. If this was occurring, it would have been transgressive on multiple levels. It would have violated racial hierarchies. It would have violated sexual boundaries and the proprieties of gender. It would have violated the fundamental legal and ideological structure that defined slavery. And it would have been unspeakably dangerous if it ever became known. Because if people outside knew that Wardwell was treating an enslaved woman as an intellectual equal, that he was engaging in the kind of relationship that modern observers might describe as a partnership, however constrained by power dynamics, the consequences would have been catastrophic for him. Not primarily because of the sexual dimension, but because of what such a relationship would reveal about the nature of slavery and its victims. The interior of Wardwell's house becomes, in this reading, a kind of alternative world. It becomes a space where the normal rules of society are suspended, where different relationships are possible, where a man and a woman who should never have been allowed to interact as anything approaching equals conduct a hidden relationship that acknowledges humanity in ways that the outside world cannot permit. This is speculative, and it is important to be clear about that. But it is a reasonable speculation, grounded in the available evidence. And it explains certain facts that are difficult to account for otherwise. The extraordinary price Wardwell paid, the deliberate isolation, the careful construction of the house to prevent outside observation, the maintenance of writing materials in the rear rooms, the separation of his life into a public performance in Charleston, and a hidden reality in the interior. Wardwell lived in this situation for 35 years. Catherine would have aged from 22 to 57. We can only imagine what that passage of time meant in the context of such isolation. Did she have agency? Did she have choice? Was she, in any meaningful sense, consent-based in this relationship? Or was it simply a different form of captivity than she might otherwise have experienced? These are questions we cannot answer. But what we can say is that the evidence suggests Catherine's life with Wardwell was not the life of a typical enslaved person. It was not the life of someone forced into field labor or domestic servitude in a normal household. It was something more complicated, more shadowed, more ambiguous. It was a life lived in hiding, a life spent with a man who had reorganized his entire existence around the fact of her presence, a life that was in some sense privileged compared to the suffering of most enslaved people, and in another sense even more constrained because it was lived in absolute isolation. And we must ask, what does such a situation say about the psychology of slavery itself? What does it reveal about the desires and contradictions of men like Wardwell? And what does it suggest about the ways in which systems of oppression create their own pathologies, their own distortions of human relationship? Let us consider another possibility, one that becomes more plausible the more we examine the available evidence. What if Catherine was not primarily a romantic interest or a sexual object? What if her value lay in knowledge she possessed,